Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be debunking 5 common admissions fears. So, one thing that I have realized over time doing this process with many different students and families is that when it comes to admissions and applying to particularly highly selective colleges, many people often are not correctly aware of where the student's candidacy sits at any given point in time, especially with respect to their long-term goals. And so what ends up happening is many people go about solving the wrong problems in terms of the student's candidacy. They worry about things that they do not need to worry about or that are far lesser of concerns or issues or constraints with the student's candidacy building. Many of the things that we talk about on this podcast are very significant and legitimate concerns. For example, one of them that we preach about a lot is the importance of early decision and nailing the strategic and gamesmanship elements of this process, particularly when it comes to that school selection and that very high stakes decision where you'll do ED if you have an ED2 backup, etc. There are also many things that people worry about that are not very high stakes or high leverage concerns, and dare I even say, are not worth worrying about at all. So while we talk about very often in this podcast, many things that people do have to worry about, and there's a plethora of those aspects, there are also some things that people can take a little bit of solace in and a little bit of a respite and not actually have to worry about that they may be worried about. So let's get into them. So number one is taking the SAT or the ECT or doing any form of test preparation before about the middle of 10th grade. So if you are a sophomore or have a sophomore at this point in time in late January 2026, I would say, roughly within the next month or couple of months or a few months, many should be starting to think about, starting the test preparation process and the SAT, ACT test taking process. That said, if you are earlier than about halfway through 10th grade, this should not be a concern in any way whatsoever. And so there are students and families where they're trying to take the SAT or ACT very early, and you're not given any bonus points in admissions for doing so. It is even the case, as I've mentioned in some of the case studies, where there was a student who had taken the SAT or ACT very early on in high school. We've seen some of those in a couple of different case studies. It is actually the case that several of the top colleges actually tell you not to do that and not to take it too early on in high school, right? So SAT and ACT or any preparation associated with those exams is simply not necessary and should not be a concern before about the middle of 10th grade. This is, as with all unwarranted anxieties and unwarranted targets of your attention and time. It is particularly bad if you are focusing on things that you do not need to concern yourself with while there are other issues in the student's candidacy. So if you're focused on SAT or ACT prep, in ninth grade, or very early 10th grade, and the student does not have, or is not on pace for the type of resume to really differentiate them at the top colleges that they want to go to, or they're struggling a little bit in a class. And by struggling, I don't mean a C. By struggling, I mean like even a B or a B plus. Those things should warrant your attention much more so, and pulling your attention to worrying about SAT or ACT or any preparation while you're in, the much younger, earlier phase of the student's candidacy, while there are many other pressing concerns. It just does not make sense, and it's a unproductive use of your attention and your time. Very similarly, when it comes to the PSAT, since the PSAT can be administered in earlier grades, it's the same logic. You do not have to worry about the PSAT even until a little bit later, ironically, than the SAT or the ACT, because the only PSAT, as we've discussed on the podcast in our episode, do the PSAT and national merit matter? That was the episode. The only PSAT that potentially qualifies you for national merit scholarship is the 11th grade PSAT taken in the fall of 11th grade, right? So that's really the only PSAT that matters for anything. In terms of how it matters, well, if you are a national merit semifinalist, that is for, the top and highest selective colleges. That's a reasonably impressive award. It's not a major award. It's more along the lines of it's nice to have in your application. It's not a major award that's going to really differentiate you, but it is nice to have in your candidacy if you can get that by hitting a certain PSAT score in 11th grade and hitting those semifinalist cutoffs. If you don't hit it, also not the end of the world, but again, it's nice to have. However, again, you can only get national merit semifinalists based on your PSAT scores in fall of 11th grade. So worrying about the PSAT at any point earlier than that or doing any sort of preparation, you're simply wasting your time. Number two, so we're going to stay on the standardized testing angle here. So many people worry about the number of SAT and ACT sittings. There is still this sort of old mythology of, not taking it more than 3 times. We do have an episode on this as well, which was how many times should you take the SAT? And we got in depth there as to what the sort of the situation is and the implementation of score choice by College Board around 2009, 2010 or so, which allowed you basically to not submit all of your testing record, which had previously not been the case with the SAT. The ACT, it has always been the case that you did not have to submit your full testing record. This risk reward dynamic is fundamentally different if you are not compelled to send your entire testing record, right? If you would have to send your entire testing record and there would potentially be, some low scores on the testing record, then that would be a lot riskier of a situation. But as it currently stands in 2026, and as it has stood for many years now, students are in absolute control of their testing record, whether it's through the College Board for the SAT or through the ACT org for the ACT. You fundamentally choose what you submit to the colleges in terms of your testing record. And so there is the back end of what you actually do in terms of how many times you take it and sit for the exams. And then there's the front end or what you ultimately go on to present to the colleges. And you do not need to confuse the two processes. They are separate processes. There is the test taking phase, and then there's the test reporting phase. And it makes sense to bifurcate and separate the two and view them separately. Just to reiterate, there are no negative consequences outside of, testing fees and a bit of your time to take the SAT and ACT several different times. Number three, so visiting colleges that don't have a high stakes decision plan that you would apply under. So if you're very sure that you are not going to be applying early decision or placing a binding commitment to a given college, or you're not going to be applying at that college under a decision plan that is in some way restrictive, right? Whether that is restrictive early action at Georgetown and Notre Dame, or it's single trace early action at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, and Caltech, or early decision at all of the different schools that offer early decision. Those are the three different plans that prohibit you they block out other schools in a given round. So if you do ED1 to X school, you can't do ED1 to another school. If you apply single choice early action to Yale, you can't do early decision. You also can't do early action to all of the private universities. You basically need to look ahead before you do school visits. You need to sort of see the end, I often say, before you start. You need to understand the dynamics, albeit fairly complex dynamics of decision plans, and understand, does this school have a decision plan that would preclude another school? Basically, do I need to get this information from this school visit in order to inform a high stakes decision down the line? And the way that a lot of people approach the college visits is, the sort of information they're trying to get is whether they're including it on their school list or not. That's not really the critical information that you need to obtain from a school visit. It's very easy to put a school on your school visit list, right? It's as simple as adding it, in the comment application. There will of course be, some specific school supplements for that school, but it's very easy to add a school and to submit an application. That's not really what you are initiating the behavior of doing a school visit for. You're initiating the behavior of doing a school visit much more so for the strategic elements of down the line, I'm going to have to figure out, do I like Brown enough to do ED, versus doing an ED to Penn or etc. Right. And you have to be able to see where the plans are going to conflict with each other down the line, because you will have to make a decision down the line. You will not be able to simultaneously apply under a given early plan in many cases in the same round to multiple of your top choice schools, right? So that's really the most important part about visiting colleges, given that we are in many ways reverse engineering from the schools at which you would be using your early card, right? And you only have one or two early cards in your pocket to take advantage of that you can utilize to give yourself a much higher odds of admission. We really want to be focusing on schools that you would use your early card on them, right? You would apply ED to this school, right? And so reverse engineering and using that mentality, we really are going to be focusing more on schools that are going to be very good schools that are towards the upper bound of a student's candidacy. Now, that is not to be confused with schools that are impossible schools, right? Schools that some people label as reaches, but they basically are not in any realm of possibility for the student's candidacy whatsoever. But you do want to be operating towards those upper bounds and be thinking about schools that you'd be very excited about attending under this sort of notion of using the school visits to identify those early schools. Now, what ends up happening is people worry about visiting a whole bunch of schools, and they visit schools that are low targets or safeties, and they just visit schools that are simply not necessary. For example, let's say you're a Virginia state resident and you know that you'll probably be applying to UVA, but you know that it's not going to be an ED school, that you would never apply early decision to UVA. It's also a very large institution, which means that demonstrated interest is highly deprioritized anyway. That is not really a super important or high priority school visit for you, because the visit's not going to change anything. You're probably just going to apply EA as you should. You're a Virginia resident. Obviously it's a great flagship institution. You'll get the residency bump by virtue of living in Virginia, but it will be an EA school, right? You going to see it unless again you think that it would be, you think it would be an ED contender. Outside of that, the visit's not really going to change much because you would just be applying EA either way, right? And so it's thinking about the visits in terms of, is this going to help me make these high stakes decisions with respect to my early colleges? Many people are just very wasteful. They worry about seeing like a very wide swath of colleges. And it's just, again, it's not very difficult to add a school to your list and to apply to it down the line. A visit list is not the same thing as a school list. Many people confuse the two. There are many high schools and many counselors that sort of use the two simultaneously. In fact, halfway through junior year, when they're sort of providing school lists or the counselors or whoever, they will call it a school list. But a visit list should not be the same thing as a school list, right? Because when it comes to a school list, you can apply to colleges fairly flexibly. But when it comes to visiting colleges, they may be all over the place. They might not be very convenient or geographically proximal to each other. And so it's not feasible for many families to go visit 20 colleges, right? However, you can apply to 20 colleges, right? And it's not that difficult. Again, there are school-specific supplements, but that being said, many students nowadays do apply to a whole host of, different colleges. Number 4, in terms of unwarranted fears, discontinuing an irrelevant or low-value activity. So I mentioned this on a previous podcast. I'm not sure which one. I think it was maybe one of our application reviews. So many students and families get worried, for instance, if they've partaken in a sport. If I did soccer for 2 years or 3 years and then ended up dropping it, is that going to look bad on my application? If the activity is not relevant to the student's admissions hook, it's not relevant to the core theme of their application, and or particularly when both are the case, it's a pretty low value activity. Now, if it's low value, but it is relevant to the student's admissions hook, that's sort of a little bit different in terms of, including the application or continuing it. But particularly when you have something that's irrelevant and it's low value, it satisfies both of those conditions. And this is particularly, in many cases, going to be sports. Discontinuing track in junior year or senior year or cross country or soccer or whatever it is, that is not going to hurt you at all in the admissions process. However, if you discontinue something that is quite relevant to your missions hook, and your candidacy, you are the cognitive science kid who founded the cognitive science club, and you did it in ninth and 10th grade and founded the club and were active in the club, and then all of a sudden it goes entirely dormant and dark in 11th and 12th grade, that would be super, super weird, right? And that would look very, suspicious and, very odd. So, for anything that is, if you're a member of the newspaper and you write an article, once every century, and that really doesn't have anything to do with your admissions hook because you're a student, who's interested in aerospace engineering, you can shave some of these time commitments. And in fact, it is very important for students to do addition by subtraction and to correctly audit their time allocation to ensure that their allocation of time is putting them on the right path to accomplishing their goals. And so many times students should be auditing and then they should be shuffling around their time commitments, particularly as you get to the later grades and things really sort of pick up in terms of the amount of work, the rigor of a student's courses, SAT and ACT, etc., etc. But as far as worrying about this sort of continuity, of an activity that is, particularly both irrelevant and lower value, that is not something, that you should be worried about. Now, in terms of its placement in the application, do you put, I did JV soccer, freshman soccer, JV soccer in the application? In many cases, no. It's just gonna dilute down your hook, if it's not relevant, which it's not going to be unless you're, a recruited athlete, but then in this case, you obviously wouldn't, be discontinuing it. Or, if you had something that it was relevant to, some sort of, sports theme, but for most students, they in many cases would be better off, omitting. It really depends on the context of the student's candidacy. For some other activities that are a little bit more academically relevant than sports, such as you were on the newspaper and maybe you did write an article that is somewhat relevant to your theme, it's very contextual, and you have to be able to see all the information that would go into the application and know the students' themes to make that sort of judgment call. But it is the actual case, contrary to what many people believe and do, that you can simply leave out some of these very irrelevant and low value activities from your application altogether, and that might be very much to your benefit. And on this point, there is what's known as the sunk cost fallacy. So the sunk cost fallacy is basically, you are walking in a certain direction, and you're walking, and you're walking, and you're walking, and you sort of put in all this time to walking towards a place that you thought is where you wanted to go. Somewhere along the way, let's say, 60, 70%, you've been walking for 2 years, but you determine, that it is very likely that you are walking in the wrong direction. It does not make sense just because you have walked this far to keep walking in the wrong direction, right? So you do have to be willing to cut time commitments that you have determined no longer serve you. And you have to not be subject to this sunk cost fallacy of, well, I've walked so far in this direction, but if it's the wrong direction, the time for you to start walking back in the other direction is now. Number 5, so contacting admissions reps. So this will apply for students all throughout high school, but particularly for students who are a little bit later in the process, junior year, particularly as they start doing school visits, and then even more particularly in senior year. So we do have yet another full-length episode on this topic. If you want more of a deep dive, that episode's called "Should You Contact Admissions Officers?" And that was our episode that was devoted a little bit more broadly to demonstrated interest at large. But in terms of contacting admissions reps, it's very often the case that students and families in fall of senior year, they sort of get wind that, another family or another student is sort of contacting the admissions reps and sending emails, and then they're worried that they're not doing the same thing. And it sort of sounds like maybe, they're building connections or networks, or they're really helping their admissions odds, and it simply is not the case. And many students and parents get worried about this, and it is not something to be worried about. And as we mentioned in that episode that I just alluded to, if you are going to be reaching out to admissions officers, there should be a contextual reason for doing so. I would not consider it the case that a good contextual reason for reaching out to admissions officers, hey, I was looking through the website and I had a question about this. That's not really a legitimate reason to reach out to an admissions officer, particularly at a highly selective college. However, if the admissions officer comes to your high school in senior year, as many of them do at many different high schools around the United States, and you met the admissions officer, it's very nice to sort of send a little note with a little follow up. And I gave an example of this in a template in that should you contact admissions officer episode. But the points of contact with admissions officers should be very sparing, and they should be highly contextual and based on sort of some circumstance in which you interact with them or interface with them. Otherwise, you risk coming across as potentially manipulative, weird, asking a question that, maybe the answer is easily, online. You can come across as a little bit annoying or burdensome, and it's just not really doing anything for your candidacy, and it can be a slight net negative, in fact, right? So this just isn't going to do anything to fundamentally move the needle of your candidacy. It doesn't even really do much, even if you send it after meeting an admissions officer or after an interaction. It's just sort of a bit of a checkbox item to sort of cover all of your bases. But this is not something when people sort of talk about, reaching out to the admissions officers, or I'm doing this. And it's sort of this notion of the person thinks that they're really doing something, for their candidacy. It's not the case at all, and people really should not worry about it very much at all. That is it for this episode. 5 common admissions fears that we debunked, 5 places where your anxiety, your attention, and your time are not well used or justified. So we talked about SAT and ACT, or any sort of preparation before the middle of 10th grade, worrying about the PSAT at all before 11th grade, fall of 11th grade, number of SAT and ACT sittings, not something to worry about. Student controls their testing record. Visiting colleges that don't have a high stakes decision plan that comes into conflict with another high stakes decision plan. Those early cards that you would be using and that would come into conflict with one another. Visiting any colleges where that's not the case, or much lower priority colleges, is not something you need to worry about. Discontinuing irrelevant or low value activity, especially a sport. And last but not least, contacting admissions reps. These are 5 things that many people worry about far more than is actually justified. That's it for this episode. Hopefully everyone found this helpful, and we will talk soon in the next one. Bye-bye.